Hi, I'm Maril McDonald. 27 years ago, I founded my firm, Gonzaga McDonald, on the premise that organizations don't transform, people do. Since then, as we've worked with many of the world's most admired global companies to navigate the human struggle of change, one thing has remained true: leadership matters a lot. Let Go and Lead is a podcast about what it takes to be a leader and how great ones balance the head and the heart to transform the companies that transform the world. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Adrian Popa, an associate professor of organizational leadership at Gonzaga University. As a professor, Dr. Popa combines deep knowledge of philosophy and theory with an emphasis on adversity and extreme situations. He explores what contexts like refugee camps and intense mountain climbs can teach us about leadership. Over a delightfully sprawling conversation, Dr. Popa and I discussed the core of mutual trust, authenticity, and love that drives the best servant leaders, and how we can cultivate these qualities in ourselves and those we lead. Whether you're leading a team, a company, or just beginning to step into your own leadership identity, there's something here for you. So get comfortable and get ready to let go and lead. Hi, Dr. Popa. Welcome to Let Go and Lead. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Maril. Good morning to you. It's wonderful to be here.
So you have quite a fascinating life and career. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and really how you got into the leadership space?
Most certainly. I think early influences came from life as an immigrant to the U.S. Out of Eastern Europe, with a father as a refugee and receiving asylum in the U.S. And a lot of my early upbringing, as well as education, but that upbringing and early experiences, life experiences, really informed my academic training, my direction, essentially, of what spurred curiosity around the human condition, around resilience, most especially, leading into clinical counseling after academic training, of course, and then most certainly into research for a number of years, through doctoral education, of course, as well, and then more so in terms of looking at the human condition around the role of resilience in organizations, and perhaps even more so the pathway to resilience.
Well, there's a lot there that I want to follow up on. It's so interesting because I can't imagine another time where resilience and hardiness are more important, just with everything going on in the world. And, we do a lot of work at Gagan where we talk in business transformation, as you know, but we really believe that organizations don't transform, people do. So it has to start with leadership. And what do you see as the connection between personal transformation and organizational transformation?
Yeah, I love that question because it allows us to frame that personal and organizational transformation, perhaps around this what I would call, and what the literature calls, and the evidence that is out there, really around existential courage, and how that's framed in the context of hardiness, which we'll continue to unpack, throughout our conversation. But so when we think about existential courage, it's first and foremost owned by the individual. So, or we're called into that space. It's an invitation. So it's my perception, let's say, and as I enter into an organization or a team and what have you, is there psychological safety? Is there existential safety? And how do I kind of engage in that? Is there an opportunity to speak up? Do I feel safe to be able to question, to doubt, to confront ambiguity or uncertainty in various contexts? And most certainly, and also with that, this fear of judgment, perhaps, in the sense of, having the autonomy to think and to be an independent agent in an organization. It touches a little bit on this concept of self-determination theory, which is a balance between autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And that is essentially also what contributes to our motivation to feel, engaged in an organization, to feel part of an organization, to be called into an organization. Do I have the autonomy to think independently, to perhaps contribute to the larger mission, or perhaps the larger goal of our mission, essentially? But there is a point somewhere in our career that we perhaps encounter in terms of what is life asking of us? What is this organization asking of us? This team, this project, what have you? And those are two different spaces, realities that we're holding. There's at times we can call this self-preservation in terms of, how am I advancing myself, my career, what have you. And then there's also this other dimension of, what is being required of me. There's also permission maybe to be whole and honest. Um, can you bring your full self, your inner tensions, convictions, and questions into the workplace when you think about personal transformation and organizational transformation? And what happens when we have to stifle that back, in terms of our wholeness, our honesty?
How does one develop existential courage?
That is a good question. It's a framework that comes out of positive psychology and health
Mhm.
psychology. So how does one develop existential courage? It is perhaps by embracing uncertainty, about perhaps embracing discomfort, about recognizing we are to unpack, let's say, existential courage. It is a larger framework of psychological mindsets. It's also the self-care component. There's also this dimension of um, this social support that all these dimensions here are perhaps in most what we learn from evidence to support hardiness as a pathway to resilience. Now, psychological dimensions of or psychological hardiness, we can deconstruct those into, let's say, three practices or three mindsets.
Well,
One of which
I'm gonna
is
just stop for a sec. Is psychological hardiness the same as existential courage, or are we switching topics?
no, great point. Existential courage is the larger construct, and hardiness is the operationalization,
I
the way
see.
to practice, I would say,
Uh-huh.
existential courage, by the way we view the world or the way we view challenges, perhaps. Do we see them as occurring as a normality, in our everyday life? Do we see them as worthy of influence and growth? And they have a purpose, a larger purpose, even beyond ourselves, quite often. And so first of all, what is that challenge mindset that we bring into our deepening understanding of this existential courage? Another dimension of is also control. The internal locus of control, where we encounter uncertainty, perhaps ambiguity in organizations. In that that transformation that you were referring to, both from the self and organizations, are we free agents to make sense of, to find deeper meaning in uncertainty, to listen to our inner voice, to perhaps our inner critic, our doubts, and are we an open agent to listening to those and how we move forward? And then the third dimension of kind of psychological hardiness, which is a way to live out existential courage, is what are we committed to perhaps our values and with and for others. So on any complex project, on any uncertain endeavor, how do we step into that space of clarifying our values because we're committed to our team in the larger picture of what leads to organizational transformation, right?
Yeah. There's something that's coming out of this that I just really like to explore with you, and I'm not even quite sure how to ask the question, so hang in here with me. But, you brought up the concept of autonomy to contribute, which I thought was a really interesting way to phrase it. And then you also talked about the courage of being a free agent. So what I'd just like to tease out here is the whole concept that in an organization and as leaders, we have the responsibility of agency and autonomy ourselves, but we also have the responsibility to give it to others.
Mhm.
And what do you find as the kind of give and take between those two roles?
Hmm. I would see. I love the way you framed the question because it's an invitation from the organization to engage the agents, which is colleagues, and so much more of those that represent a team, perhaps those that are on a mission to accomplish a goal, or accomplish a mission, a larger mission, than one individual's. You know, the way psychological hardiness, or perhaps the overall pathway to resilience, is framed as how does an organization essentially, again, uh, within the context of psychological safety, how do we have clarity of purpose during disruptions or ambiguity? Are there models that, or perhaps practices that are set within organizations that guide our process? Do we have a shared values contract? Do we have a playbook for how we move through uncertainty and processes, complex processes? We know again from masters in the field that there is a certain practice that that we come to and rely on, and that informs our process too. Is there a certain modeling and presence from various individuals and then in the organization to model and to represent a way of being in an organization? You may call that leadership. We may call that leadership. It may be influence. It may be compassion. It may be care. It may be spotlighting strengths and gifts of someone else that are beyond any of my capacity, your capacity, or anyone else's. Void and remove from the conditions of a position, right, or a role. And do we have that existential courage within an organization to recognize that, to bring that in, to call that, and to honor it for that individual? So how does that relate to autonomy? That gives tremendous invitation to autonomy, to a way that someone can breathe into their capacity, to their growth, and especially, we feel that we belong, we matter in an organization. So mutual support, trust, agility, and kind of, in the way we share decision making. There are a number of practices that are ever so subtle in organizations as we think about the role of autonomy, as well as contribution to a larger goal, a larger mission. How we call it everyone into that space.
I'm so glad to hear you talking about practices and processes, because I think so often there's a lot of effort put around mindset and willingness, but one can be willing and still not be very effective if you don't have the right practice or process in place, right? So that was just interesting to hear. The other thing that I'd love to ask you about, and now I may not quite remember the term right. When we talked about psychological safety, which of course most of our listeners would be very familiar with the work of Amy Edmondson and all of that, but you then also talked about, I think it was psychological courage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other side of the coin, right? It's the courage of creating psychological safety for yourself, which I think is very, very critical in any relationship. And yet there's very little conversation around that. It's always around, it's my job to make you feel psychologically safe. But what's your part?
Actually, I love that question because we teach a number of experiential courses. Are we, Ignatian pedagogy, in a way we approach learning and entering spaces or communities? Do we bring in context of recognizing where we're at, right? One course that I teach, that we teach at Gonzaga, our students love and do not know what they're entering into at first, because they see it as a mountaineering course, climbing Mount Adams here in the Pacific Northwest. And yet they recognize as soon as they enter the course that, oh goodness, okay, there's quite a bit of material here. There's about 10 weeks worth of material that began, with the most immediate call of that internal leader. And what is my responsibility? And that translates to so many parts from theory, most especially that in evidence that we know, to the practice. So, as a metaphor for life, but also the physical sense in mountaineering or in the outdoors, in the backcountry, you bring your own self-sufficiency at first. You have to be ready, for, let's say, an organization, your team. You've done the good work of preparing with the gear, in terms of working with your colleagues and teammates, in terms of preparing what is your role also perhaps on the team? You might be the communicator, the convener, you might be the expert in the gear, you name it, right? So there's tremendous self-sufficiency, and of course there's training. There's also the psychological training and the spiritual dimensions that we bring into the mountains, into the outdoors, and that sets the energy, the synergy for the larger context of a given team. We haven't done our inner work first, or even our practical work in entering space and entering a collective, larger vision and perhaps mission with the team will struggle. They'll feel perhaps untethered or disconnected in some regard. You know, I, and how we make sense collectively of getting to know each other, as well as your role, perhaps your purpose and how we bring that collectively into our larger goal of climbing, for instance, in the backcountry, where it takes tremendous interdependence by that moment once the team comes together in the various, stages of a given mountain.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we do a lot of immersive experiences in nature, and a lot of them around working with horses because horses are such a mirror of how one shows up. But what we've seen is that people bring the same patterns to unfamiliar circumstances that are the patterns they've learned to deal with, and by working with the horse, they can kind of work through them. So it sounds like a similar situation where they're in a very unfamiliar situation, climbing a mountain, but the same patterns start to emerge, and you begin to see them in a very different context.
Very much so. I love the concept of a mirror, because the mountain is truly a mirror into how we represent, how we are, again, process, make sense of, find deeper meaning of ourselves in uncertainty, ambiguity, quite often complexity, and even volatility that happens in the backcountry. In my middle daughter is an equestrian, so I
Ah,
fully know that whole relationship between rider and horse. In the dressage arena, or perhaps in stadium jumping, or out, on the cross country. It is the horse knows who you are the moment you enter the barn. In terms of how your day was, and again, it's a mirror to that connection. Whether you're a team,
yeah.
rider and horse, or kind of a high stakes also, they both are, in the context of climbing the backcountry for sure. So,
Yeah. What's interesting too is the thing that's most important to the horse is that you show up in your authentic self, right?
yeah,
The horse will
oh,
take you any way you are as long as you're authentic,
yeah,
because it's the lack of authenticity that they don't feel is safe.
it is beautiful. Yeah.
So, well, let's talk a little bit about. I know you also are a huge believer in servant leadership, and what do you see as the most critical aspects of that? That's obviously also a very commonly phrased term, but not always well understood, I don't think.
I am so grateful that you bring up the practice, the way of being, I would say, the philosophy on life of certain leadership, even perhaps even the test of a certain leader, that's rooted in growth, the well-being of others, essentially at its core, and the best test of a certain leader is, do those served become healthier? Are they wiser? Are they freer, more autonomous, perhaps? Here we are again talking about autonomy and agency, right? More likely themselves to become also servants of others and with others and for others. So this is where we begin to see a philosophy on life. It's not so much, how do we serve others or how do we serve an organization, but how do we enter a relationship? Is someone Are we thinking of an organization, a project, a plan as a way of leveraging, as a way of influence, as a way of doing something with? And there's parts of that, because there are many corporations, organizations that, have a certain strategy. So it's not, to demystify that, we're not saying that's an ominous area. Yet, how do we enter that space with others? Because there's a human condition that even on that team that others bring into a larger project, that there's both the technical challenges and then these adaptive challenges that are at play. Um, and there's a great relationship, I would say, between or the test of a certain leader, because it does shift our focus away from a leader's position, perhaps even their charisma or various achievements, right? And instead asks, do the people around me learn and grow? Are they better off? Maybe even ethically, maybe personally, holistically, spiritually, emotionally, you name it. Did the leader empower others? Did they offer, going back again to psychological states that you're familiar with, to become leaders and servants themselves? So do we ask ourselves, daily, how did I contribute today to lifting someone up, as we review our daily lives, before, beginning anew, essentially. So did others rise as a result of my presence in the organization, on my team, in this committee? Did we leave perhaps a meeting that others felt compelled that, oh my goodness, yes, we're so glad that we had this meeting, right? Versus good riddance. I'm glad this is over.
We've never had that meeting.
But did I feel more connected to Maril,
Yeah.
after a conversation? Do I want to spend more time with, am I a little bit challenged by the way she thinks, about life and maybe, if she took an interest in me. So there's all of these little subtle practices that we can do, right? That we perhaps overlook or in the expediency of time that we may negate or not think of them or see them as, perhaps these soft skills. And yet they are so difficult to practice, because they require so much intentionality from all of us.
Yeah, that's the old adage, right? The soft things are the hard things. Yeah. This reminds me too, I know you talk a lot about collaboration, and I was wondering what you really see as the true conditions that enable people to collaborate. Because this is another one where I think there's often a sense of, well, you're just collaborative because you're nice and you get along with people, but there's a whole process and system to that as well.
In times of uncertainty and ambiguity, do we model calm and constructive energy, for instance, when the budget is strained, perhaps when we have that email or that memo drop in our inbox, right? Um, resilient leaders or hardy leaders perhaps regulate their own emotions in a certain type of groundedness or steadiness in the sense of being in that space. It doesn't mean that we're also not human, right? Because by the whole means, we're stirring inside, and yet how do we offer perhaps a glimmer of emotional resilience, making space for both challenge and recovery, or perhaps understanding and discernment of making sense of that memo or that email drop in our inbox, right? Is there trust in that process? Can a team member come directly to you, or do you even model that? Do we model that by perhaps acknowledging some of our unknowns, right? Do I have, what is my relationship with my own efficacy in that internal locus again, where I'm comfortable expressing to my team some vulnerability, appropriate vulnerability that, right now we're not sure.
Yeah.
We're, gathering more information. We're assessing the context, and most certainly, we are with you in this discernment, the contemplative space, really. And in that regard, also, are we sharing decision making? Nonetheless, again, outwardly sharing the some sort of agency and autonomy in adaptive thinking, allowing real time responses as well, to maybe shape those conditions of collaboration. So there's steps or processes, like you call them, or practices, do we take time to celebrate and acknowledge? So again, such a subtle, reminder, and yet someone feels like they're acknowledged, that they matter, that they're bringing something to the team. Um, Also, do we have shared accountability rooted in compassion, though, right? Rooted in something versus shared accountability, so everyone gets the blame, right? No, it's we've seen that occur as well, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's well, okay. How do we have a compassion around it that
Yeah.
we hold each other accountable? So resilient teams holding each other accountable, with not necessarily in blame, but perhaps seeing the larger shared purpose and care. Okay, that was a miss. Yeah, how do we reconvene here? How do we perhaps step on the balcony to see the technical dimensions that are happening on the dance floor? And we're looking at, what did we do? How did this performance go? What are some of these missteps? How do we come together again? As we look at this vantage point from the balcony to understand, our process. And we do this routinely, even when we reach, let's call it, physically, but even metaphorically, a certain base camp of a project, right?
Yeah.
For us on the mountain, yes, at base camp, we review the day that we just, experienced, and what are
Hmm.
some tremendous celebrations again? What are some misses? What are the attitudes? The activating moments that were part of the day. What are our beliefs about each activating moment that happened on that first day? Because quite often the second day is won or perhaps conditioned by the first experience of the first day, how we treated each other.
Yeah. What I love about that is your whole metaphor of being on the balcony is we're all standing together looking at the problem. We're not looking at each other as the problem. Yeah. I love that.
Or bumping into each other on the dance floor,
Yeah, well, there you go.
Because the view is just right here, eye to eye. Maybe someone's,
Yeah.
making taller or shorter, but nonetheless, we're all, yeah.
Yeah.
But we do. We need to draw back to the balcony, or to base camp and look back, down the mountain or on the dance floor to regain an understanding of the day. And what are, inevitably, what are some of the consequences of the beliefs that we bring in about various activating moments and how we address them, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, that's great. And that kind of leads to the whole conversation. I know you also talk about that hardiness isn't just about being tough, it's about being adaptable.
hmm hmm
And so I just want to ask you about that. Like, do you see, I think everyone would agree that adaptability is important, and people talk a lot about the importance of purpose. Do you believe one can adapt one's purpose, or is that a long-term fixed point of view?
do I think that someone could adapt their purpose? Say more about that. So just so I'm not going in a rabbit trail in the
Yeah.
context of hardiness or resilience or
So you've talked a lot about the importance of having purpose. And some people would say that one's purpose is innate to oneself or fixed in a way. I was just curious, do you feel that way, or do you feel that a purpose can adapt given circumstances and over time?
there's so many
Uh,
dimensions of life is not constant. Life is a constant reformation, a constant reforming, a constant perhaps even breaking down of the will, so of the ego, of the reframing of of who we are. So does our purpose continuously change throughout life? One would hope so. It's again our own invitation to that space, our own relationship with uncertainty, with doubt, with a greater vision and a greater listening to what is being asked of us. We on the mountain here, we make things very simple because in highly volatile and complex situations, you don't need like 10 steps or this theoretical understanding of who knows what. You know, we focus on three things. It's be, love, and do. So the be part, how are we showing up? For ourselves and then for our team on in the backcountry. Have we done the good work of self-reflection, of that deep work,
Yeah.
of the independent work that we, in the, the independent work first that we're bringing to a team, the skill sets, to you name it, the preparation, right? And holistically, how are we showing up? Who do we want to be, and for who, right? Second, love, whether it's love or care, but really at any given day, it's how do we care for ourselves and others, if love is an action, if caring is an action, my goodness, those are endless practices, right? Um, from the very explicit of acknowledgments, right, in an organizations and spotlights on individuals and you name it, right? Some traditions that are part of many cultures. And then there's also all these subtleties that we talked about, through our conversations. It's the leaning into, hey, I'm seeing the way, you could have entered our meeting today or the room. You didn't say much. I'm just checking in with you. What's going on? Or I can see on your face, is hard, or not necessarily projecting, but you hear,
Yeah.
when you're ready to talk and how, or let's go for a walking meeting, get our, step away from the office or the desk or what have you. So there's so much of our humanity that we need to bring in through that care. So be, love, and then do. So quite often in the work that we create together, individually, but most especially together, and that is essentially the inspiration of, we were created to do, to make, to be contributors to life, for something again, with someone.
One of our operating principles in the firm is when in doubt, do the loving thing. So kind
I
of
love that. You can't be
plays
literally.
plays into that. That's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and that sort of explains, I think, how hardiness and servant leadership really relate to one another, which is great. So, another concept I know you're very passionate about is heart-centered leadership. And to me, that's the core of human centricity, which is what we're all about. What do you think, and how would you like to define it?
The heart. And again, going back to our conversation around be, love, and do, perhaps, a framework that it seems to be kind of very common, or maybe, integrated in the work that you are leading with colleagues in larger firms as well. But if we, it is through, I would say, love that we recognize the essence of another person, not just their capacity, their traits, their capacity, and maybe even the skill sets they bring, but to their unique potential and spiritual core of who they are. In other words, the heart love allows us to see others as they are meant to be, right?
Mhm.
And not just how they are now, perhaps imperfect, perhaps, having successes but misses, but maybe their ideal self, um, and who they aspire to be. So
Yeah.
it's a key source and love is a key source of me, because that's where we find humanity and a reason people can endure also uncertainty, essentially. Because if we see something more in someone through through the care, through the compassion, through our connection with them, um, and most certainly, that takes on a different dimension of both humility, authenticity, perhaps transparency, that we bring into organizations, let alone perhaps even our credibility and the trust that we create in organizations as a result. Uh, it also speaks to this concept of self-transcendence. Many have written about as well, around how self-transcendence also is uniquely different, most certainly, than self-actualization. Again, with self-actualization, there's a meeting of our own goals, or perhaps um, our truth to our own life, and it's a pursuit of oneself, essentially, in some context
Mhm.
of that pinnacle. Whereas self-transcendence, it goes beyond. There's a intentional discomfort in that it needs to reveal something about us, in how we move beyond ourselves, so focus beyond ourselves.
Well, there's just so much I'd love to ask you about, but I know we're short on time, but maybe the last thing well, I have 2 questions left. One is, what advice any other advice do you have for leaders who are really leading people through this crazy, uncertain time?
You know, we touched on every generation has the belief that we're navigating unprecedented times.
How did that say ask the
It's,
question?
it's a beautiful concept because but here we are entering. It's important to see
Yeah.
ourselves as distinct, right? Because there's only one moment in this history that we're experiencing right now,
Yeah.
and it's okay to call it unprecedented, recognizing that we are also learning from the past, and being, um, uh, you know, um, present in that context. You know, the unprecedented times, have also a representation of how we are entering this space with existential courage, with an affirmation of, what are we committed to and who are we committed to? That psychological mindset.
Mhm.
Um, are we invited into the space of unprecedented times with a certain set of agency, an internal locus that we have a responsibility that we are bringing into this world? So often we ask ourselves, what do I want from this world, from this side or that side, this news cycle versus that news cycle, but perhaps what is the world asking of me right now? And allow that to stir inside of you, any of us, and perhaps with great discernment and conviction in how I'm responding to the question of life, in that invitation, because all we have at hand is choice in that space between stimulus and response, and how we choose to, engage, enter, um, accompany our colleagues in that space between stimulus and response. That requires tremendous existential courage. It requires, it yields tremendous growth, in how we enter that space. And most importantly, it leads to freedom. For me, it leads to freedom of the mind. It leads to freedom of the heart, of the spirit, of our connection with each other. And most certainly, also recognizing that there's this dimension of challenge. Yes, these are unprecedented times. And yes, they will be here again tomorrow and the next day. And not simply to normalize it, but to be in the moment, to enter into this
Mhm.
moment of who we want to represent, both ourselves and collectively, and recognizing that there's something important of of this dimension of uncertainty, or of discomfort. There's a reason why we take our students to places of uncertainty and tremendous discomfort.
So I have one more question. This is a question I always have to ask because, of course, this podcast is called Let Go and Lead. What do you think leaders most need to let go of?
Themselves. If we're talking about self-transcendence,
Mhm.
and as we enter these spaces, um, we enter and need to let go, perhaps, of our most immediate, kind of, this triangle of that focuses more so on ourselves, so perhaps for our own development, in equal balance, obviously, because again, we talked about that self-care to the self-transcendence, being there for women and men, for others, most certainly for the larger humanity. You asked about unprecedented times. Yeah, unprecedented times because we are, on a mad race for self-actualization, individual self-actualization as well, and perhaps out of balance with also self-transcendence, of being there for others and with others collectively. We are created to be in a relationship with others. A number of things at Gonzaga that we believe about leadership. We believe that it's learned. We believe that it's for everyone, not just the person, on a, kind of in the context of leading an organization, but everyone influences organizations. So we know that very well. Wherever you're at, we have unique pieces to the larger body that constructs of our identity. And we strongly believe that leadership is a relationship, most certainly. The core of how we are, we love, and how we do. And leadership is about the whole person. It's the mind, the body, and the spirit. That collective governance of those three dimensions represent who.
Well, Dr. Popa, this has been a fascinating conversation. And as I say, I have so many other questions, but so appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Maril.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let Go and Lead. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If you found this episode insightful, please follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and subscribe to us on YouTube. And don't forget to check out past episodes and interviews on GaganMacDonald.com. Thanks for joining, and see you on the next episode of Let Go and Lead.